host. You're watching Big Picture with me, Bharata. Before I proceed, let me ask you, have you subscribed to the channel and liked the video? If not, please do so now. We have an informative monthly newsletter. Do subscribe to it. And how can I not tell you about the Bharata First Knowledge Center, our big success story? It is a one-stop destination for all your competitive exams needs. Hundreds are reaping the benefits. Make sure that you are not left behind. We now have 26 courses to address your learning needs, all available at less than 1,000 rupees per course as part of our ongoing early bird offer. What's more, the first 100 to register will get a further discount of 10%. So what are you waiting for? Register now at kc.bharatafirst.com and be a part of this amazing way of learning. Don't miss out. All this information along with some must-see recommendations are in the description of the video. Please go through it. And now on to the discussion. At the COP26 Summit in Glasgow, Scotland, India committed to what many feel is an extremely ambitious target: net zero emissions by 2070. While there aren't many details available with the public as yet about the exact pathway, most of the conversations on climate change in India evolve around a few areas. The Union government's focus has primarily been on non-fossil fuel or renewable power generation, solar being the main driver, with wind coming in second and a small portion reserved for hydroelectricity. Indeed, the focus could be seen from two separate pledges made at the COP26. First, the non-fossil energy capacity would go up to 500 gigawatts, and second, half of the country's energy demand would be met through renewable energy by 2030. In this edition of Big Picture, we will analyze the COP26 Summit and India's climate action plan. Joining me on the program today are Samrat Sen Gupta, who is the Program Director, Climate Change and Renewable Energy at the Center for Science and Environment. Also with me on the program is Urmi Goswami of the Economic Times and Ambassador Suresh K. Goyal, retired diplomat. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of Big Picture. Urmi, let me start the program with you first. You were at the summit. Take us through the highlights, take us through what happened, and take us through how the summit itself transpired.
Okay, so this is 2 weeks of intense activity. Like in Paris, the UK presidency, the UK was the host, decided that they should start off with a leaders summit because that would set the political tone for COP26, which was slated to be the implementation COP. If you remember, this COP was supposed to be held in 2020, but had to be postponed because of the pandemic. And the Paris Agreement kicks in from 1st January 2021. So basically, this was the send-off COP, the starting point. We're now meeting a year later, a year into, so to speak, everything's got delayed. So in 2021, we were meeting. And therefore, to give it a right send-off, we are talking about raised ambitions, because you must remember in the interim between 2015 and 2021, not only has the pandemic happened, which has disrupted our lives, but also the IPCC, which is obviously the climate change science body, has brought out its report as requested by the COP in Paris. That's COP21 in Paris. That is, all the countries asked IPCC to make a detailed assessment about warming at 1.5. So by now, there is the clamor that had been there to make 1.5 the temperature target has been growing. Obviously, we are still maintaining the Paris language of well below 2 degrees and with best possible efforts to 1.5. But the effort was to get as close to 1.5. So that's the background to COP26. So we started off with the Leaders Summit. As you will remember, that Prime Minister Narendra Modi attended the summit and he made the announcements, putting across India's contribution, renewed contributions, because obviously India already has a set of contributions which have been submitted under the Paris Agreement. These announcements that the Prime Minister made are yet to be submitted. But very quickly, we committed to increasing our non-fossil fuel generation capacity by to 500 gigawatts. It was 450 of which is renewable, which is wind, solar, and perhaps a little biomass, and little small hydro, but basically wind and solar. And then 50%, the Prime Minister's words were 50% of energy requirement by 2030 will be met from renewable energy. The next thing was about emissions intensity, which will be reduced by at least 45%, and 1 billion tons of projected emission reduction at 2030. That is, whatever we project, emissions we project will for 2030, 1 billion tons less. And finally, the net zero sort of announcement of 2070. Prime Minister Modi wasn't the only leader there. There were 120 leaders, various kinds of announcements, some about funds, some about commitments. But what had set the tone was for the high-level political tone for the negotiations. I know, what you have then is also that, and after this, there are two sets of activities that happen, which is sectoral activities. You have the finance sector, fashion, sports, all kinds of things, each one coming up, trying to move the needle forward and sort of encapsulating activity that happens outside of the governmental setup. In the meantime, the negotiations are on, which is to complete the Paris rule book. There were three major outstanding issues. One was actually four in a manner of speaking, but one was the carbon markets, which had a couple of portions to it. The other was on enhanced transparency. And finally, the common timeframes. That is how, what is the time period for which countries have to submit their NDCs. Now that this part of the negotiation, which is completing the Paris rule book, kicked into high gear in the second week. And we had what at the end is the Glasgow Climate Pact. I know this is like, I've tried to compress everything in, but the Glasgow Climate Pact tries to bring in some of the strands from the outside world into it, and also to reflect the achievements made. Like one example is the methane pledge. More than 100 countries signed. India is not one of the signatories, but methane pledge to reduce the percentage of methane, I think by 30%. I can't remember exactly, but by 2030. And that has found a reflection of sorts in the Climate Pact. The World Leaders Summit finds. The final document, which is the first of, it's a series of decisions, but this is a cover decision, the Glasgow Climate Pact. There are issues with it. There were concerns about it not being completely balanced, which is still the concerns that are still alive. Loss and damage, a big issue, which did not get as much attention as it should have, or got the attention but didn't get the decisions. Let's put it this way. That's a better way of putting it. But of course, people remember the end of the Glasgow COP for the high drama over the coal phase out, phase down question. I can come back to that in a bit, but that's broadly where we are.
I mean, wonderful, Urmi. Thank you so much for putting it so succinctly into perspective for us. 2 weeks of activity covered in just 5 minutes. Wonderfully done. And I can't think of anyone else who could have done that the way you just have. So thank you very much for putting it into perspective for us. Really commendable. Coming to you now, Samrat Sengupta. Let me come to you now. From a diplomatic point of view, because when we look at climate summits, when we look at climate change, it seems like the entire world is concerned about it and everybody wants to do something about it. But there's hardly any action that we see. From that perspective, what are the takeaways, do you think, from COP26?
I am following climate debate from 2002, particularly the COP8 happens in Delhi. And now, till now, it becomes an exercise of English language text where urging or request the difference of the word and its weightage in the negotiation text matters more, rather than why the commitment of 5.2% or 5.4% in the Kyoto has not been met. Nobody talked about it. There is no compliance mechanism in it. So it becomes a voluntary. And the essence of what ambassador has told about 1994, the common but differentiated, the condescending approach of the North always likes the common. They forget about the differentiation. And it was put completely under the carpet in Paris. The good part, now, it's all about criticism. We should not criticize, we should also look for the way forward. The good part of this COP, some of the issues which was put under the carpet, like loss and damage, like finance, though not quantitatively, but qualitatively come on the discourse. But is 3 decades is not a too vast a time frame of the world to first recognize that yes, this extreme climatic event happening due to human-induced climate change or anthropogenic climate change, like IPCC has told, what is the new modeling exercise they have done, which has just come out this year to say it is 100% climate change. Previously, the North was discussing that for any climatic event to calculate the loss and damage and its impact due to anthropogenic climate change, what are the fraction of it is responsible for climate? So when the climate change impact is particularly hitting their backyard and post COVID, it has been understood the definition of vulnerability has changed. It is the North was always in a mind, we have the money, we have the resources, we will be not impacted. They understood, no, it's not the case for any global calamity. And probably COVID has shown them they are the most vulnerable. So suddenly the scientific community means it's also a political game of how we interpret the science. The IPCC report suddenly said it's 100% proximity of that everything happening is due to climate change. Last 3 decades, what was the communication? No, it's nothing new. We are just believing on some optics. And for India, yes, we have taken a very grand stand on the present debate. But if you see very minutely, not criticizing the optics of it, we should play that optical part. But we have taken a calculative measures. If you see whatever been committed has been already analyzed in 2019 CEA report, which shows by 2030 our non-fossil mix in the total power generation will be 525 gigawatt. So we have committed 500 gigawatt. So it's all well calculated, and good part of it that by 2030, what are the power requirement we have? We have only 1/3 been operational now, rest 2/3 to be built. And we can build it in a green way. Why we should build it in a green way? Because it is cheap, it is modular, it addresses our access issue. This is the first. Plus, it will address to the climate issue and local environment issue. So this is a win-win game for India. We are doing that. We are not following the old way of development. We will be coming up with a new way of development to be happening in the southern world.
Right, absolutely, absolutely. All right, Ambassador, let's understand this whole issue of climate change from a global perspective. And, do you feel at some level, be it Kyoto, be it Paris, and now even, Glasgow, that these are just words and, developed nations don't really walk the talk?
Thank you very much, Frank. And after what Obi has said, my task becomes simpler and more difficult really in that sense. Simpler because I don't have to go into details of the discussions and the deliberations in Glasgow. But the first thought that when I was watching the developments in Glasgow, the first thought that came to my mind, I happened to be in New York in 1994 and the times when UNCED took place in Rio. And that was the very first meeting which alerted the world to the possibilities of what the climate change could do. And here we are now in 2021, when I think the first thing that we must notice is, and I'm going to be very bullet point really here now. We all know that Glasgow was basically in terms of developing a global architecture to implement the commitments or the agreements in Paris and before that in the Kyoto Protocol. Efforts have been made to really develop that architecture. 2020 we missed because of pandemic, but so far there was no such rules and regulation which would actually bind countries on how to achieve it. This was one attempt when that architecture had to be developed. Now, the first difference that you notice is that from that hesitancy in the beginning, even in Paris and Kyoto, as to what we are going to do, and kind of a very warmish, hesitant commitment of particularly the developing countries and the countries which didn't have resources, to a kind of uniform commitment by everyone that yes, the climate change is real and the world has to tackle it. I think it's a very fine point, but nonetheless, the realization is not universal. Everybody knows it, number one. Number two, I think you will notice that in Glasgow, there was a very gentle shift. We may not notice it, we may not articulate it. So far, the watchword in climate negotiations had been shared but differentiated responsibilities. In terms of the developing countries having less responsibility in terms of making the commitment than the developed countries. Nobody talked about the shared and differentiated commitments in that kind of the framework anymore. There was this gentle transition, I think, to that, yes, it's a responsibility for every country to share in meeting their NDCs, nationally developed contributions. And in fact, it was decided that by next year, they will come back with a kind of a resolute plan of the national determined contributions. But I think the shift was that, yes, we all have to meet it, but how do we meet it? So there was a change from hesitancy to a process in which clearly there was a responsibility for the developed countries to find out the finances, find out the resources to meet these obligations on part of transitions in the developing countries where they all accepted the need to transition. Point number two. Point number three, I think what Prime Minister Modi said was not simply, I must confess that I'm very fond of somebody said jumlas, that he has this kind of watchwords which he says. But this time when he gave this Panchamrit, the 4 points, I think he took the leadership. He showed to the world that yes, India is committed to meeting its responsibilities to the climate change. In fact, it took the lead by suggesting the shift over to sustainable lifestyles. For the first time, somebody was saying that it's not only a question of technology, it's a question of adopting your lifestyles to the climate, which actually rhymes with our own ancient wisdom that take as much as you need rather than what you want, but what you need. So essentially, just a gentle shift, but again showing the way that we need to have sustainable lifestyles. One last point. I think India took the leadership in the beginning of the leadership summit, but somehow along the way, we lost steam. We basically became part of the same ways of negotiations where, yes, we had the objective clearly. It is going to be difficult, I must say, if you look at what we need to meet this 2070 net zero commitment and to reduce to 50%, 500 gigawatt of non-fossil energy by 2030. Is it 2030? 2030. It's going to be very, very difficult. 8 years. we don't have the resources. But the fact is that by coming down to coal out, coal phase out, phase down, etc., which are important, but we didn't have to really get into that kind of a thing and maintained our high platform. Somehow I found that was a bit. So that is where I will stop for the time being, Frank, if you, since I think I've overshot my 5 minutes, but I think that is where the things were really. And India certainly displayed leadership at one level, and at the other level, we frittered it away.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think very, very valid points made there by the ambassador. We started on a high, but somewhere along the way, we lost ground, lost track, and we fizzled out as well. Yes, Samrat Sen Gupta, you wanted to add something. Go ahead.
Yeah, just want to add, I accept all the back-end negotiations, all the bilaterals and what was happening, and India's concern about the coal phase out. But when the text doesn't have a timeline mentioned to it, why to be so sensitive and why to lose the optics which we have generated on the first day? It's really a childish diplomatic approach. If you read the text doesn't talk about a timeline. Is it 2070 or 2100? No.
No, sorry, I just want to add this one bit. I did ask this question actually, because that was among my first reactions. Was that actually my first reaction was India should have stuck to fossil fuel, because the moment you say fossil fuel, the atmosphere in the room would have changed, because all the players, and Samrat would be able to tell you about that, as would Mr. Goel, that how the game would change, because everybody has their iron in that fire. But I had asked about this timeline, that why bother when there is no specific timeline. The general overwhelming sense, not just for India, but among several other countries, was because if you look at the mitigation section, it's all about 2030 timelines. And therefore, there was a sense that even unwritten, it would become a pressure point. Now,
Sure.
As I said, it's a matter of perception. It's a matter of understanding. One can go with Samrat's option of, there was no timeline, why push? But as I said, if you want to be safe rather than sorry, then you had a very good option, an option you yourself had utilized a few days before in closed rooms, which you would have got support.
Absolutely.
Marshall Islands wouldn't have turned around and said, the phasing out of coal was the only dim bright light, and that also has gone. You wouldn't have had that occasion happen. I think that was played badly, and I'll come back to this. It is because there is no unified conversation. Everybody seems to be managing the show, but nobody is talking to each other at our end.
Yes, Samrat, go ahead. You can complete the point that you're making.
No, I am completely agree on various points as Urmi also put out. Just on the part of when there is a backroom discussion, I do understand. It was been agreed that South Africa will voice the concern, and at the last minute in the plenary, the South African lady has walked out. So we haven't played the diplomatic, because South Africa is one of the major exporter of coal. Australia is one of the major exporter of coal. They have business interest to it. Similarly, Indonesia. And our interest is that we cannot phase out coal immediately in 10 years time frame due to our grid stability point of matter. It is not economics. Economics always support even the
Right. Seem to have lost Samrat Sen Gupta. Then, Ambassador, you've been patiently listening to everything that is happening. You're the diplomat, you're the ambassador here. So, your thoughts on.
Frank, I was not surprised. I've been part of this kind of debate and discussions for not 40 years, but 4 years when I was working with the United Nations. It's a story of all our discussions and debates. Problem is, and I'm going to be very, very candid about this. We do not often start with a strategy to negotiations. We seem to, like Urmi said in the beginning, there are different arms like the Durga, and each arm works in its own manner without really realizing that ultimately it is only one mouth and one head which actually operates all these arms. So now what happened in Glasgow is that the Prime Minister makes these statements which are very, very ambitious. I do not know if there was actually, since I'm retired now, uh, compared to Samrat and Urbi who were there, and Samrat must have been part of the strategy making team really, even before the delegation went to Glasgow. The problem is that I do not know whether the Prime Minister had been made completely aware of the implications of the ambitious statement that he made at the leadership summit. That sounded very, very good. But for example, when we talk about 500 gigawatt non-fossil fuel by 2030, all right, we have the capacity, but what are the financial costs? What is the cost to the grid? How do you stabilize? Renewables, how do you develop the storage? There are those technological sides, so there are financial side to it. It's not really that you don't want to do it or you can't do it, but there's a cost to it. Can you bear the cost? That there was no thought to it. When you go into a negotiation of this kind, a multilateral negotiation, before you enter the room, you develop your lobbies, you develop your working papers, you develop your non-informal consultations you choose which countries can come in support of you. Didn't happen. And therefore, while you had the objectives, what you thought, in fact, in our case, I think even the objectives developed over time in Glasgow. Before the delegation went to Glasgow, I get a sense from the tenor of discussions that we had not even thought about what we are going to argue about and what we are going to negotiate for. So it's a story of many of these negotiation strength. And I think eventually, you talk about coal phase out and phase down. Even the fossil fuel, have we thought about that even if we were to phase out gas by 2030, where would we be?
Yeah.
No, so let us not talk things out of thin air. We cannot phase out even fossil fuels by 2030 or 2050. The only renewables, what are you going to work on? Wind, solar, what? How do you make it sustainable? With the technology, what is the cost to our development? Nobody worked on all those things. So eventually, you are talking about Australia, UK, etc., Australia and China, etc. We should have known that South Africa will not support us. We should have known that Australia cannot support us. If Australia's main revenue sources come from coal, if South Africa, I know for a fact that South Africa's main mineral export, one of the main export is coal. When South Africa was under sanctions and they didn't have oil, they resorted to coal to liquid technology because they had plenty of coal. Therefore, I think what we need to do is that this is as often we do, we start on a high note and eventually during the negotiations we fizzle out basically because we didn't have a strategy. I'm sorry, it was a kind of an outburst rather than anything at all, but a story of our lives. And lastly, I would say that rather than acting a hydra-headed and like multi-armed entity, I think we should really act in a more coordinated fashion. Let there be one central point where everything comes together. I'm not saying it is Ministry of Environment or Foreign Affairs or what, whoever. Normally, when I was in the Ministry of External Affairs, we have always said that because we have the experience of multilateral negotiations, everything should come there. All points of view should come there, but they know what actually makes out. For example, how do you know that you cannot get Australia on board? Because you have been talking to Australia for 20 years and we know what makes them tick. So I think that is what it was really about. We essentially, but not all was lost, frankly speaking. Not all was lost. It's a kind of a thing, document, where there is sufficient escape valve, there's sufficient the guideline, guidelines, guards which have been built up. And therefore, I think one can operate within those guidelines and those regulations still to safeguard our interests. But while working on those safeguards, I think we need to work on a strategy that does take us to 2070. We will. Before that, net zero, but before that, how to reduce our dependence on coal. I mean, even our stocks of coals are not unlimited. I hope you will accept my this outburst, Frank, but
it's not at all an outburst, Ambassador. It's candid. You were candid and it was required, and that's how we understand and that's how we know exactly what's happening as well. It's experience that is talking, it's not an outburst. All right, time to get quick closing comments from all my panelists with the best way forward and what next. Starting first with you, Urmi. You're on mute.
Very quickly, I want to say that a lot of these calculations, Samrat mentioned the document is a CA document, which was finally published in 2020. It does have a roadmap. All the things that the Prime Minister announced are in that document. So it is not that this hasn't been worked out. Yes, costs and investments are an issue, which is why the net zero announcement is so important, because that's like telling the world, we recognize climate as a risk, and therefore we will work it into our policies. What we do from here on, how we translate our requirements into policies, this road into a policy of from here to 2070, at least from here to 2030, then 2050 is what is critical. So that is the most important thing. Second, in terms of who negotiates, what they say, understanding, yes, Mr. Goyal is right, we should all come together and work. But the problem is this, is that we need to recognize that climate change is a critical issue. It is not an also another thing. And unfortunately, that is how it has been dealt with for a long time. And now that, I mean, look at the United States, look at the European Union. They bring climate change to the center of their game. It is for us to the center of our game. As for whether we can have common ground with countries we haven't had in the past, I suppose that is what we have diplomats for, to create those grounds, to find those interests. Climate change offers that opportunity, and that needs to be sort of explored and understood. It's something that we have very poor understanding of.
Sure.
And I think, and which is why we lose out on the people, countries we should have relations with. The South Pacific Islands, I keep coming back to the Marshall Islands. That should have never happened, but
Right.
it did happen. And one final thing, what we need, yes, is not just a unified approach, but also an approach that makes space for everybody, not about one set of people controlling the narrative, keeping others out. It is about understanding that climate change is not just about extreme weather. It's about society, it's about economy, it's about opportunity, it's about changing the way we do things. And that
Absolutely.
requires everybody to come in and work together.
Absolutely. Samrat Sengupta.
Yeah, just now I am trying to put my hat on civil society. We have seen that bringing out a people's issue into a political agenda has worked. The main villain, US, to come back into the multilateral mainstream again. We have where climate change is one of the three main political issues that drive the last election. We have to make it happen in other parts of the world, including our part of the world. And that will create a political so-called awareness about the agenda, because their voting decisions will happen in those agenda. That's one good part of the civil society movement that has seen around the globe, particularly in US. We have to learn from it and put it in action in our part of the world. Second point, On the technical issue, whatever I completely agree with you, Urmi, whatever been announced by PM was all thought of. Only I am concerned, I don't know, it still exists in MEA side, 50% of our energy needs from renewable energy. This, I think, has lost somewhere between translation from Hindi to English. 50% of energy.
Oh, no, it's electricity. It was
if
talked back to electricity.
if it is even 50% of electricity from renewable, we are talking about a 700 gigawatt plus of installation, because India has a definition on renewable. We do not consider nuclear, we do not consider large hydro as a part of renewable. If you calculate on that, same day I have done the calculation on the reverse that it is 750 gigawatt of variable new renewable energy we need to put into the grid, and you know the amount of storage it requires. Storage is yet to get the economic operational level to be deployed into our country. It may take another 2 years to be, and then we have a 5 years window to. So I think there is some level of tweaking need to be done on that 50% renewable.
Absolutely. And Ambassador, close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
Very briefly, Frank, I think the roadmap is clear. Yes, we were not very clear, but 500 megawatt, 50%, like Samrat said, we didn't work it out clearly. Investment, we didn't clearly work out how much money do we need. Okay, my suggestions are very simple. We have already underlined at the end of the negotiations that our meeting the goal depends upon the financing, and the developed countries have to meet their commitments on the financing, number one. Number two, we need to work on the technology adaptation. Without technology being made available for adaptation and mitigation, is not going to work out. Number two, that was number two. Number three, I think we need to work out on our own energy mix. We need to change this insistence on renewables to basically a non-fossil fuel kind of a thing, where the nuclear energy can come into play, and we can work out on the grid, which is more durable, because that is going to be really the key issue. And lastly, in any global action plan, we need to basically maintain the developmental aspirations. You cannot stop the developmental aspirations and the goals of countries like India or China unless they are able to maintain their 6 to 7% of GDP growth. It's not going to be worth it really. So I think those need to be built in, and then work in an integrated, coordinated manner. I use the word integrated because coordination here sometimes lead to non-coordination and things really going astray. So I think we need to be integrated into one team for negotiations on these issues. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. All right. We'll have to leave it at that. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. So what's coming out of this discussion is that India started the summit on a high, but somewhere along the way, the steam ran out and we ended on a low. There was a lack of coordination between ministries and we weren't a cohesive unit. We should have had a strategy and worked out a plan with the other countries going into the summit itself. India has set itself an ambitious target, and indications are that we will achieve them as far as climate action is concerned. When it comes to multilateral negotiations, we have to be better prepared and work as one unit. We should preempt what other countries are likely to do and do all it takes to make sure our plans aren't derailed. Well, before I go, let me once again remind you to like the video, subscribe, hit the bell icon, and share the content as well. We have an informative monthly newsletter. Ensure that you subscribe to it. And let me also tell you about the Bharata First Knowledge Center, our big success story. It is the one-stop destination for all your competitive exams needs. Hundreds are reaping the benefits. Make sure that you are not left behind. We now have 26 courses to address your learning needs, all available at less than 1,000 rupees per course as part of our ongoing early bird offer. What's more, the first 100 to register will get a further discount of 10%. So what are you waiting for? Ensure that you register now at kc.bharatafirst.com and be a part of this amazing way of learning. Don't miss out. All this information along with some must-see recommendations are in the description of the video. Please go through it. That's it from me. See you again next time.